Welcome everyone to this is module 2. This is focused on chapter 2 of Economic Report on Africa 2019. This is particularly focusing on fiscal policy and development finance. And this is one of the most important chapters because it sets the scene on finding the different sources of finance for the sustainable development of the continent, particularly in its attempt to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The slide you have in front of you shows what we are covering. The most important starting point is to understand the role of the fiscal policy, which is the first topic, and then we will then discuss the financial requirements for the different social, economic, and environmental targets that the continent has to achieve by 2030. We will discuss fiscal developments since 2000, because 2000 is a very unique year. That is a year that Africa started really doing very, very well in GDP growth. And we will try to discuss the impact of fiscal policy. And there is an optional discussion based on a study that I have conducted with my colleagues at the ECA, and we published it in African Development Review. That paper, you can download it and read it in your own time, and it is optional. It is not mandatory. Therefore, when it comes to the discussion, I leave that to participants to pursue and see some of the analytical, technical work that we have done in establishing and estimating the amount of money that Africa needs to achieve the important sustainable development goal of reducing poverty, reducing inequality. And there are questions and answers that we will always provide, and also exercises, but that will be covered in a separate text. So now we start discussing about the important roles that fiscal policy plays in economic development. Macroeconomic stabilization is one of the important roles that fiscal policy is playing. And there are others such as long-term growth. Sometimes you use fiscal policy like revenue raising and also allocating different expenditures to stabilize some macroeconomic stability. But that is a traditional role of fiscal policy. In addition, the most important one is to use the fiscal policy for long-term growth. In this case, in our course, it's sustainable economic development of the continent. And fiscal policy can be redistributive because taxes can be really used to redistribute income in an economy. Therefore, the fiscal policy can be used to promote equitable, inclusive growth. That is growth which doesn't leave everyone behind, rather which brings everyone on board. Fiscal policy can also be used for diversifying economies and for structural transformation based on the policy allocation for the different sectors, the major sectors being agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And fiscal policy, again, through its taxation and non-taxation rules, can encourage investments. For instance, we know that many African countries attract investment from abroad and usually gives tax incentives, and that is a role that falls under fiscal policy, and eventually that is used to encourage foreign direct investment and other types of investment. As I said before, traditionally the focus of fiscal policy was on stabilization and fiscal consolidation at the time of downturns, meaning cutbacks when things are hard. This has had detrimental effects on the long-term economic development, particularly if expenditure on human development, health, schools are always cut. The redistributive power of fiscal policy shouldn't be underestimated, and taxation, progressive taxation, taxing more when someone gets more money, and subsidies, social protection or social safety net are always useful instruments or policy levers to redistribute income and improve the economy. Here I want to highlight the difference between acyclical and pro-cyclical fiscal policies. In many cases, many countries spend a lot of money on education, roads, and other infrastructure and hospitals when times are nice or when revenue is very high. So every time that you see a fiscal policy, it is tending to be pro-cyclical. Austerity and fiscal consolidation are common measures when financing needs intensify. To create jobs and achieve long-term development objectives, it is necessary to adopt counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Therefore, countries should really be driving fiscal policy in the direction of investing in core sectors such as health and education and technological advancement or human capital development, even when times are hard. Therefore, for job creation and better redistribution, counter-cyclical fiscal policy is being promoted. The weaknesses that we see in terms of some introductions of some policy initiatives in relation to fiscal policy include the introduction of VAT and also high rates of VAT, because these are taxes which are applied across the whole income distribution, and they can be damaging or they can be regressive. Therefore, there should be some careful adoption of value-added tax for different groups of society and for different commodities. Therefore, by choosing the commodity mix where VAT rates are applied, you can really make the introduction of VAT more progressive and more fair. Other weaknesses in the fiscal policy is the provision of tax breaks for multinational companies. Many countries just compete on giving tax incentives just to attract foreign capital. And this is usually referred to as a race to the bottom, because everybody is cutting and the only beneficiary will be not African economies, but also the multinational companies. Therefore, there should be a reasonable rate of tax incentive instead of excessive and provision of very, very long tax holidays for multinational companies which are exploiting opportunities in their continent. There is also some introduction of new taxes such as social media tax, particularly in countries such as Uganda and Kenya. There is a recent debate how this can be detrimental, because there are a lot of mobile money transactions, and if you are taxing individuals for such transactions, it is working against financial inclusion. Therefore, for financial inclusion and for unbanked individuals to be financially active and included, I think the introduction of such taxes, such as social media tax, shouldn't be there. Counter-cyclical policy, as I mentioned before, are being promoted a lot because they are helpful to reduce unemployment and also on inflationary pressures. The fiscal policy, which is counter-cyclical, limits the impact of government expenditure shocks. And it is useful if it is coupled with prudent approach to manage taxes and expenditure to limit the impact of business cycle fluctuations when times are hard, for instance. And there is a strong pressure to follow pro-cyclical fiscal policy, and this is an easy way for many countries. When revenues are high, they just spend more. When revenues are low, they just cut back on expenditure, and they really go on fiscal consolidation too much, and that is maybe detrimental for employment and poverty reduction. But in most cases, it emerges due to weak public financial management. And when times are good, I think countries can make an effort to save some money for rainy days or for bad days. Therefore, a precautionary saving by resource-rich countries, particularly when they benefit from commodity price booms, can be very, very useful to avoid the trap of falling into pro-cyclicality. Instead, they can keep on spending on key economic sectors for the benefit of society. And in many cases, how countries raise finance is important to consider, and many countries use trade and trade taxes to get revenue, and that serves as a development finance for different allocation reasons for different sectors. Trade attracts foreign direct investment, and revenue from trade is important for most governments. That's why when you have a free trade agreement, many governments are a bit uneasy because they lose a lot in terms of revenue. In the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, many governments used expansionary monetary policy and interest rate cuts to stimulate their economies, which is quite sensible. But due to muted recovery after that, many policymakers resorted to fiscal policy to kickstart high economic growth. Therefore, you see some economies, even if it means expanding fiscal deficit, they still invest in public projects and infrastructure to boost economic growth across all sectors. This shows the importance of the state in steering economies out of downturns, and it also shows the importance of fiscal policy in general. Now, we focus on the money that Africa needs to achieve its development goals. So, what are the financing needs? What are the financing sources? And how can we estimate the financing gap is a very important set of questions that we are going to consider. In Africa, there are huge financial needs and financial gaps in order to achieve the SDGs by 2030 for obvious reasons. And you have different estimates by different sources. For instance, Schmitz and Traub estimates that we need between 614 to 638 billion US dollars a year over the 15-year period. And the financing needs for the poorest countries and those with bad initial conditions are larger, unsurprisingly, because they are very, very far from the desired development targets. The needs are estimated to be $1.2 trillion a year in low-income countries, including the lower middle-income African countries, or about 11% of GDP of those countries. That is a huge amount of money that Africa needs for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many, from a technical point of view, there are different techniques that are used to calculate the financing requirements. And unsurprisingly, readers and observers and other professionals who are interested in finding the actual estimates, they find technical discussions and also the estimates confusing. So, as I said, there are many of them. Some of the financial requirements are sector attached because some estimates, they say, oh, we have financial requirement for education, we have financial requirement for environment, we have financial requirement for health and so on. But the overriding truth is that development finance required for Africa is enormous, and we can safely say that it is an insurmountable challenge to get the funds in place for the targets to be achieved in the next 10 or so years, because now we are in 2019, we have only 11 years to achieve the 2030 development goals. My work, along with the work of Zevi and Adam, and also my colleague in the World Bank right now, what we have done, it shows we need 1.2 trillion US dollar a year to achieve only Sustainable Development Goal 1, which is eliminating extreme poverty. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, as we know, estimates that Africa needs 210 billion for basic infrastructure, food security, health, education, climate change, mitigation, and global investment needs of 5 to 7 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs. So these are sector-specific as well as broad, all SDG-specific estimates. IMF also makes estimates that 49 low-income developing countries need on average additional annual expenditure of 520 billion US dollar or 14% of their GDP, with some countries needing even more, such as Benin and Rwanda, in terms of percentage of their GDP. I want you to know that estimates also vary depending on the growth scenario, from about 300 billion US dollar for a high growth scenario to about 900 billion for a low growth scenario. So it depends on how fast the countries are growing and how much they can also raise, depends on that speed of development. What are the fiscal developments since 2000, when Africa has started to be improving in terms of growth of GDP? So we will discuss fiscal developments in the following key areas. In the area of domestic resource mobilization, in the area of government spending, in the area of fiscal balance, or if you like, fiscal deficit, and fiscal space, which is measured as a debt threshold for relative to GDP, or fiscal space, or the amount of fiscal budget that countries can mobilize, and the room that they have to spend for development purposes. Now I will focus on domestic resource mobilization. To see the efforts of governments in DRM, for short, many researchers follow key ratios such as revenue to GDP ratio, the total revenue that you collect in the country divided by the GDP of the country. This ratio fluctuates in Africa, for sure, because we have 54 countries and each case is different for the last 18 years. One strong source of this fluctuation was the 2008 financial crisis and the volatility of commodity prices. So whenever you have a collapse in commodity prices and global financial shocks, the ratio is much lower. Still, even if Africa has registered good growth over the last 15 or 19 years, it has the lowest ratio of all global regions in terms of revenue to GDP ratio. And you can see the figure 2.1 from the report chapter 2. There is a scope for increasing this ratio. You might ask, so what do we do? For instance, we can do better tax administration, better collection. Also, we can do better management of existing resources and collection of other sources of revenue, such as non-tax revenue. Despite the wealth in oil exporting countries or oil-rich countries, revenue collection is the lowest in these countries. And the same is true with government spending. Therefore, figures 2.2 and figure 2.4 show you this trend. These oil-rich countries lag behind in implementing fiscal reforms and installing better financial management in terms of commodity booms. Because of the excess commodity revenue that they get when prices are high, they neglect the fiscal side of the budget because they can easily win elections by using the oil money for some big projects which can appeal to the electorate. In terms of fiscal balance, we can say that this is a very important measure of the health of an economy. Many countries normally run fiscal deficit, but it is the sustainability that we are worrying. In Africa, expenditure-driven growth has widened the fiscal deficit. Therefore, some countries started some fiscal consolidation. Despite the measures, given the trajectory of the growing public debt in Africa, the fiscal deficit of African countries is also growing, because the speed that debt is growing is faster than the consolidation that African countries are implementing. And future forecasts show that this will be the case. Therefore, we need a very strong macroeconomic management in all African economies to improve the fiscal balance. According to IMF, the fiscal space is defined as follows, and I want you to keep that. That is the ability of a government to raise spending or lower taxes without endangering market access and debt sustainability. Therefore, the room that you have to raise funds is important, and the room that you have also to spend. I should add that the ability to have the fiscal resources in place without compromising the welfare of individuals and households. Because with harsh cuts in fuel and other subsidies, as well as social protection, or without any social protection for the ultra poor, the general welfare will suffer. Therefore, I think fiscal space should keep the welfare aspect of individuals and households in mind. The big challenge for Africa is the lack of fiscal space in all countries, and these are really displayed in figures 2.5 and 2.6 of Chapter 2. There is a room of flexibility, but that is a very little room for flexibility. And the fiscal resources to promote economic development are very limited for Africa. So the assessment carried by IMF shows that there is limited fiscal space overall. And there are 5 relatively stronger economies such as Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, even in the strongest economies. In that case, governments need to strengthen spending controls and boosting efficiency of spending by focusing on growth-enhancing sectors instead of spending it and you don't have a spillover effect in terms of development. Investing in infrastructure is one of the good investments that African governments can do. Spending needs to improve productivity and also align the achievements to the SDGs in order. From a policy perspective, governments will need to leverage public-private partnerships. They should work with the private sector to raise funds, mobilize the resources, and also invest that in priority areas to achieve the SDGs. But we know that there are a lot of challenges how you can bring private capital and the private sector to work with the public sector, particularly when it comes to regulating activities and also monitoring and also following up on accountability if something goes wrong. Who is going to be blamed in this partnership? Now we will discuss the effect of fiscal policy on economic growth, on macroeconomic stability, and the pace of structural transformation, meaning the relative importance of manufacturing compared to agriculture, or the relative importance of the service sector relative to the manufacturing sector. Only 4 countries follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy so far, and this is encouraging. And these economies are doing okay, particularly economies such as Ethiopia and Morocco. This counter-cyclical policy is not a guarantee for success, but it is a science of prudence. Ethiopia is doing well, as an example, and in the long run, Nigeria will benefit because this gives its fiscal space when oil prices face a downturn. And the debate whether to use pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical policy is not settled, and in many countries, pro-cyclical policy is still the norm, but there is encouraging movement in the direction of counter-cyclical policy, fiscal policy. And from the literature, we have evidence that growth benefits if one chooses to follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, abandoning a cyclical fiscal policy. We continue discussing the impact of fiscal policy now, and in this case, it is useful to examine the effect of fiscal policy instruments, taxation, expenditure instruments, and so on. Taxes are not detrimental to investment. Therefore, there is a room for African countries to still tax investors without really discouraging foreign direct investment. Therefore, there is no need to participate in the race for the bottom. African governments shouldn't run to make huge tax concessions. As I said before, there are gross benefits attached to spending on key sectors such as health, education, and this should continue regardless of the fiscal balance. Trade benefits investment expansion, and we expect the future free trade agreements that we have at the continental level will improve. Protectionism is not a solution to trading relationships, and trade openness also leads to better investment outcomes. Therefore, there is a strong interaction in the intersection between trade and investment. With regards to the individual and household welfare, the fiscal policy of African governments should really focus on how the welfare of individuals and households is maintained and guaranteed when it is applying different fiscal instruments. So the power of the fiscal policy should be deployed to reduce poverty and inequality, which are the ultimate challenge of the continent, and also even other global regions such as Southeast Asia and Latin America. And we know that Africa is the only continent with increasing number of poor people, and inequality is also getting worse. Therefore, there is a need to use fiscal policy as an instrument to make growth that is encouraging already, which is existing in the continent, to make it inclusive, without leaving women behind, without leaving young people behind, and without leaving the poor and unemployed behind. Prudent fiscal policy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for long-term economic development, because we need other policies to work. We know that governments also follow carefully, and analysts also do so, the ratios such as tax to GDP ratio, which is lower than other regions. And we need to address the problem of unregistered firms. We need to address the issue of corruption. We need to address the issue of tax evasion by big companies from abroad, from well-advanced economies. And in terms of tax collection and administration, there should be an improvement in the continent in all sectors, in all countries, to really raise the financial requirements for achieving the development goals, or to improve our domestic resource mobilization capabilities. So from a tax design perspective, it is wise to focus on unexploited revenue sources, such as property tax, beyond regressive taxes, such as VAT. Sustainability is very important, and it is a matter of urgency. Many governments can spend a lot of money and impress the population, but at the same time, this shouldn't be compromising sustainability. Countries benefit from regular assessment of sustainability of their current debt burdens. One way of doing so is to carefully consider the consequence of any expansion of sovereign borrowing. Therefore, they should keep a balance between concessional loan sources as well as also non-concessional sources of finance, such as from the private capital market. Sustainability improves in the context of using borrowed funds for development, such as government capital expenditure and public investment for infrastructure. And internal revenue is boosted with better public service provision, because the citizens are willing to pay if there are good public sector provision, and credible threat to deviant behavior by firms. If firms are found to be avoiding taxes and also evading taxes, the government and the rules and regulations should be enforced, and also battle with corruption and the officials that are promoting it, and also introducing a good mix of taxation. I will stop Module 2 at this level, because all what you have for the remainder of Module 2 is an optional text which is going into more technical details and analytical details of how you can calculate or estimate the financial requirements for achieving sustainable development goals. This is a very, very important exercise. For some of you, you might just skim through this article, which was published in African Development Review, just to get an idea of the estimates and the amount of money required to fight poverty and inequality in Africa, and until we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. But some of you might also like to go into the formula, the calculations, the technical discussions, and also how you can also improve it or make suggestions how we can better estimate the financial requirements for achieving Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, by that, I conclude Module 2, and I leave the sessions or the sections and the slides of this Module 2 to you to read after this slides that you have in front of you. And thank you, and I will see you when I'm discussing Module 3.